Last week I started something. I talked about three principles of memory called impression, repetition, and association. I did it to lay the groundwork for several things that I may want to say over the course of the year, because the holy days are very much a part of God's agenda of things that He wants us to remember. They are memorials. They are repeatedly referred to as memorials, and we are asked once and again to remember this, remember that. And it seems that God has to work hard, if that's the term for it, to see to it that we don't forget. Now, I don't know about you, but in my case, that's something that has to be done, because I'm very quick to forget, very easily forget. In fact, the name Manasseh, if we found ourselves to be Manassites, means forgetter. That is one who forgets. So it's easy, it seems, to do that. Well, the sermon I gave previous to this one, which I'd recommend if you didn't hear it because of the groundwork it lays, was entitled Remembering Passover. This one is Remembering Pentecost, looking ahead to Pentecost. This is the second Sabbath of seven. And there are 7 Sabbaths that lead from the day after the Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread, all the way to the 7th Sabbath, and then the day after the 7th Sabbath, which is the 50th day. Now, you may have heard that the word Pentecost means count 50. It does not. It means 50th. So when one says the Pentecost day, you are saying the 50th day. Pentecost, like the others, is a memorial. Now, since it is a memorial, what is it that we are supposed to have as an impression, to associate with it, and then to repeat over time, so that we understand what is it that we are supposed to remember? Now, I want you to turn back to the 25th chapter of Leviticus. This is not about Pentecost exactly, but it is related, and it's an important concept to get in mind. Leviticus 25 includes the concept of a Sabbath for the land. But just as man was to take off every 7th day and rest, the land was supposed to rest every 7 years. And there was superimposed over this 7-year pattern of letting the land lie idle a 7 times 7 series of years leading up to the Jubilee year. It says in verse 8 of chapter 25, after introducing the concept of the land Sabbath, it says, "You shall number 7 Sabbaths of years unto you, 7 times 7 years. And the space of the 7 Sabbaths of years shall be 49 years. That's not hard to come by. He says, "Then you shall cause the trumpet of the Jubilee to sound on the 10th day of the 7th month, in the day of atonement. You cause that trumpet to sound." Which is interesting. The year actually would have probably turned over for them on the 1st day of the 7th month. But they did not actually blow the trumpet and usher in the Jubilee year until the Day of Atonement. And there may be reasons for that we could discuss when we come to the Day of Atonement. He goes on to say, "You'll make the trumpet to sound throughout the land, and you shall hallow the 50th year." Which, if I guess we were looking in the Septuagint version of the Bible, that is the Greek version of the Old Testament, it would say, "You shall hallow the Pentecost year." The Jubilee is the Pentecost year. And this little pattern of working for 7 years and resting the 7th year is repeated, as it happens, in the Feast of Pentecost. All you have to do with this one is to turn back a couple of pages to the 23rd chapter of Leviticus, where all of the holy days and all of the memory things connected with them, all the things you are to recall, all of the associations are all, at least in their earliest forms, laid out for us to understand and for us to keep. The question about this, as I said before, having this, knowing what it means, what are we supposed to notice, what are we supposed to associate it with, and exactly how is the repetition of it supposed to affect us? Now, first of all, in this section is the Passover and the days of unleavened bread. It begins in verse 4 saying, "These are the feasts of the Lord, even holy convocations that you proclaim in their season. In the 14th day of the 1st month at even is the Lord's Passover. On the 15th day of the same month is the feast of unleavened bread to the Lord. 7 days you must eat unleavened bread. In the 1st day you have a holy convocation, and you do no servile work therein, but you shall offer an offering made by fire." And it says, "In the 7th day is a holy convocation. You shall do no servile work therein." Now, this essentially is, in this particular package, the layout for the early spring festival. You have the Passover with all of its instructions, actually, in Exodus 12 for the initial Passover, and other instructions elsewhere. The days of unleavened bread with numerous references to what you're supposed to do in different places. But these tell us the Sabbath, the services of God. First of all, the Passover, the first day of unleavened bread, the second day of unleavened bread. Then verse 9 says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying." Now this little formula, "and the Lord spoke to Moses, saying," introduces each of the different holy day sections that we will come through. This one introduces Pentecost. A little later, down in verse 23, for example, "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying," and it introduces trumpets. In verse 26, "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying," and he introduces atonement. Just a little pattern, because you will find as you study through the Bible little patterns occurring which can oftentimes give you a framework that help you to understand or keep you from misunderstanding what it is that God's trying to say to you. All right, "The Lord spoke to Moses, saying." Now you are justified at this point in assuming we're heading on toward another festival, right? Because we're all through explaining about the days of unleavened bread. "Speak to the children of Israel," verse 10, "and say to them, when you are come into the land that I'm going to give you, and you shall reap a harvest thereof." Now, presumably, until they'd done that, until there was a harvest to be reaped, there wasn't anything to do here. But nevertheless, here are the instructions. "When you do this, and you reap the harvest, then you shall bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the priest. He shall wave the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted for you. On the morrow after the Sabbath, you shall wave it." Interesting little terminology here. Wave, sheaf. Actually, the word wave is more like brandish or shake, or it comes from the root word meaning to vibrate. Essentially, what he did was bring in an omer, although the word omer, while it is a dry measure, also is used to refer to a bound sheaf of grain. And apparently he was to take hold of this thing, go into the temple and brandish it and shake it before God, which is kind of interesting. You know, he takes it up and doesn't just wave it back and forth, he shakes it or vibrates it. I would presume when he does that, grain would fall out of it to the floor at that time. So this is to be done at a particular point in time, on the morrow after the Sabbath. Now there have been a lot of questions over the years raised about the time of observance of holy days, especially the whole set of the spring and summer holy days. There's really a lot of argument about the autumn holy days, except those that revolve around the whole calendar, so you can kind of dismiss them. But there have continually been discussions about when Passover should be observed, how the days of unleavened bread are observed, when the wave sheaf was offered, and actually when and how Pentecost should be reckoned. The Worldwide Church of God, for what was it, 40 or was it 50 years, observed it, 40 years, observed it on Monday. And then they came to see that was wrong and moved it back to Sunday. The Jews have, from time immemorial, observed it on the 6th of Sivan. The way that happens is they believe that the wave sheaf was actually taken and presented before God, not on the day after the weekly Sabbath, a Sunday, but on the day after the first day of unleavened bread, which is also a Sabbath. You could conclude that there might be a question there. The first day of unleavened bread is a Sabbath. So when it comes to this, and it says, "On the morrow after the Sabbath, the priest shall wave it," you have a question. What Sabbath? Now, there are several things you can ask yourself at this point. The answer to this becomes absolutely clear as we go along, but let's just examine the question. First of all, every place in this whole passage that you read about as something that's going to be done on a date, the date is given. The Passover is the 14th day of the first month. In the 14th day of the first month is the Lord's Passover. The Passover was to be sacrificed in the 14th day of the month at even. The 15th day of the first month was the first day of unleavened bread. The 21st day is the last day of unleavened bread. And so the whole pattern gets not the 21st day, but I forget exactly how it's worded, but 7 days of unleavened bread, and the last day is also then a holy day. And so the days are all laid out for us. And you would expect then that if the wave sheaf were being offered on the day after the first day of unleavened bread, he would say, on the 16th day of the first month, you shall wave this sheaf before the Lord, would you not? But that's not what happened. Now, there's another thing here, and I remember when I first came to Ambassador College many years ago, and we were going through and learning about all the holy days, I remember distinctly them saying that the wave sheaf was offered on the day after the Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread. And I said, how do I know that? And they said, well, Leviticus 23. And I went back and I read Leviticus 23. And I ran smack dab into a problem. There is nothing in Leviticus 23 to tell you that the first, or the day of the wave sheaf, is in the days of unleavened bread at all. There is absolutely no connection. As I already pointed out, the little pattern that is in here of introducing a new holy day comes to pass on Pentecost before that Feast of Trumpets is talked about. And in fact, it is only spoken of after the description for the last day of unleavened bread. You could make a better case, I think, for it being after the last day of unleavened bread than after the first from Leviticus. If this is all you got, just this one chapter, you could make a better case for it being the morrow after the Sabbath, that is the last Sabbath in the days of unleavened bread, than the first. But that isn't what it's talking about either. The fact is that in time it came to be that way. How the decision was made, where it was arrived at, we really don't know. We just know it was. That it came to be tied to the days of unleavened bread. But you see, what you are dealing with is as the priests were constructing, or as they were actually proclaiming the calendar in the course of the year, when they came to the early spring months, they went out and they looked at the dirt roads to see whether the pilgrims would be able to make it down to Jerusalem. They actually looked at certain conditions of wildlife to see whether or not the time of year was going to be right, or whether spring was late this year. They actually looked at the green ears of grain to determine whether they would be right in time to be offered about the time of the days of unleavened bread. If they did not look like they were far enough along, what did they do? They added a 13th month to the calendar. You will search your Bible from one end to the other to find authority for that. It is not there. But they did it. They did it because the holy day had to be tied to the harvest. That was plain. And they had nothing else to tell them what to do. So they did it. Now, it's possible that was revealed to them by God through the Urim and Thummim or some other thing. I have no idea. We are not told. But it was done. So they added a 13th month to the calendar. And I had to ask the question as a young man when I was trying to study this the first time, supposing when you come to the days of unleavened bread and you have actually added the 13th month, and because of climatic conditions, you come to the first day of unleavened bread and the grain is still not ready. What did you do? I don't know. I would sort of assume you'd wait a week and you would cut it. But you see, all this is tied to agriculture, and there are a lot of unanswered questions about it, but there are some of them that do fall in place as we go along, and they certainly do by the time we come to Christ and what the church is supposed to do. But trying to arrive at hard and fast conclusions based upon Leviticus 23 is a tricky business at best, because, as I say, there is nothing here to tell you that if the grain were still not really right toward the end of the days of unleavened bread, that you wouldn't wait a week after it was over and then go out and harvest that wave sheaf on the Sabbath after the last day of unleavened bread. Theoretically, it could be done. Why not? There is nothing here to tell you no. There is, of course, some other things that we have to consider as we go along. But let's take a look, as I say, a little further at what is involved with this. You're to bring a sheaf of the first fruits of your harvest to the feast. By the way, this is called the Feast of First Fruits. We pick up the Greek terminology for it, which is unknown at this time, and we call it Pentecost or Pistia. It is also called in the Old Testament the Feast of Weeks, and it says in Exodus, in fact, the Feast of Weeks, which is the Feast of First Fruits. And of course, as you go along, you'll begin to understand why it is the Feast of First Fruits, because it is the first fruits with which the feast is associated. The weeks, that's this succession of one week following another, don't mean anything. There's no association connected with it, with one possible exception. There's nothing to be conveyed with it. But first fruits is an entirely different matter. For one thing, it says you're not supposed to eat of the fruit of the land until you have brought an offering to God. So one of the messages involved in it is the first fruits that come out of the ground belong to God, and that you're to recognize Him as the owner of the land. In fact, over in Leviticus 25, it says you're not to sell the land forever, because the land is mine. You could give them a 50-year lease, but you could not sell land to be held in perpetuity by anybody. He says, because it's mine, belongs to me, and to whomever I give it. But he continues and says, you shall bring the sheaf of the first fruit to the priest, verse 11. He shall wave or shake the sheaf before the Lord to be accepted for you. On the morrow, after the Sabbath, he shall wave it. And you shall offer that day, when you wave the sheaf, an he-lamb without blemish of the first year for a burnt offering to the Lord. The meat offering or meal offering shall be 2/10 deals of fine flour, mingled with oil, an offering made by fire to the Lord for a sweet savor. The drink offering thereof shall be of wine, the fourth part of an hin. Now here comes the instructions that remind you of who owns the earth, I guess, in a way. You shall eat neither bread, nor roasted corn, nor green ears. And the word corn, by the way, doesn't mean our corn. It means wheat, grain, that is. Nor green ears, until the selfsame day you have brought an offering unto the Lord your God. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations. So don't eat it until you've made an offering to God. The wave sheaf was that offering. After sundown, after the Sabbath, the priest went out to a place that they had already previously selected. They cut this little wave sheaf off, and everybody was ready the next morning, and they come out and they actually go to the temple, and this thing is taken up, held up, and brandished before God. And after that, the harvest can begin. You see, what it really amounts to is the opening ceremony, as it were, for the harvest that was to take place. Now the instructions continue, verse 15. And you shall count to you from the morrow after the Sabbath, from the day that you brought the sheaf of the wave offering, 7 Sabbaths shall be complete. Even unto the morrow after the 7th Sabbath shall you number 50 days, and you shall offer a new meat offering or meal offering to the Lord. Now, I can recall distinctly many years ago when I was struggling with the question of Monday Pentecost, which the church believed at that time, and I came to this particular verse. All of a sudden, I had a problem, as did nearly everybody else, I think, that came down the line in those days, who were serious students of the Bible when they came to this verse. Because the verse does not say, to the morrow after the 7th week. It says, to the morrow after the 7th Sabbath. And the word is Sabbath. It is not week. Now, you want to interpret to be week, I suppose you can interpret it that way, but why on earth anyone would do that, I don't know, unless they are a Pharisee who is trying to justify an oral tradition of many, many generations that has placed the Sabbath on a day of the calendar instead of the day of the week. Because the fact is, there is a word in Hebrew for week. It is Shabuah. The word has a root. The root is 7. The word, the basic word 7, week is a variation on the word 7. It means 7, or a collection of 7. That's what a week is. This word is the word Shabbat. Anybody have any problem hearing that word? Shabbat. There's really very little difference between the noun form and the verb form of this word. It's one B in the middle of it. Shabbat with 2 B's is the Sabbath, or a rest, or a cessation. Shabbat with 1 B is to rest, the verb. There is no connection, etymologically, between the word Shabbat and the word Shabuah week. You would tend to think that, well, the word Shabbat must have 7 connected with it somewhere. No, no, no. The word Shabbat means rest, cease, stop, repose, relax, don't work. The word Shabuah, week, means 7. So far, so good? All right, when we come back to this, this is what we read. Unto, you start counting 7 Sabbaths, and you count all the way to the morrow. We all know what that means, I think. That's the next day. After the 7th, rest, cessation, quitting, don't working, Sabbath. If I would have to assume that if God had meant week at this point, through Moses, he would have used the word Shabuah, 7 weeks, something else, because the word is there. It's used repeatedly. In fact, I have one of these Bible programs that does indexes based upon Hebrew words, and I ran one off. And there's some, I believe, 88 verses in the Bible and about 108 references to the word Shabbat. And I went through every single one of them. There's no big problem with the computer because you just page your way through them. And it shows you them one after another, after another, after another. And there is no verse anywhere in the Bible where it can even make sense to translate the word Shabbat as week except this verse right here. And there is no reason to do it here. The word doesn't mean week. It means Sabbath. Now, to be sure, If you have had 7 Sabbaths complete go by, what do you have? Also, 7 weeks. You can arrive at that. But that's not the same as saying, unto the morrow after the 7th Sabbath. Now, there's another reason why I feel very strongly that this is talking about a Sunday or the first day of the week rather than a day of any day of the week based on the day of the month. It's the feast, it is the Jubilee year. God works in patterns, and these patterns are repeated again and again and again. Would it make any sense to you that the Sabbath in a cycle of 7 would fall in the 3rd or the 5th or the 6th or the 2nd year of a 7-year cycle? What is the meaning of, or the emphasis, or the thing to be learned from these, if the Sabbath in the 7 Sabbaths that must be complete can fall on the 3rd day of that week, or the 5th day of that week, or the 6th day of that week? There is no connection. The thing is severed. There is no comparison, and that is really not the way God works. But then again, I don't even need that. To me, the statement is very plain. Unto the morrow after the 7th Sabbath, you shall number 50 days, and you shall offer a new meal offering to the Lord. You shall bring out of your habitations 2 wave loaves of 2 tenth deals. They shall be of fine flour. They shall be baked with leaven. Now, this is really unusual for a sacrifice of the Lord. And even sacrifices that had nothing to do with the days of unleavened bread, if there was a meal offering, it was usually unleavened. This time it's not. They are leavened. They are the first fruits unto the Lord. You shall offer with the bread 7 lambs without blemish of the first year, 1 young bullock, 2 rams. They shall be for a burnt offering to the Lord with their meal offerings and drink offerings. All these things are all laid out for us. It says in verse 21, you shall proclaim on that self-same day, it shall be a holy convocation to you. You shall do no servile work therein. It shall be a statute forever in all your dwellings throughout your generations. Now, it goes on to say, when you reap the harvest of your land, and this, by the way, don't ever forget, this is all tied to harvest. And every bit of the impression and the association and the repetition on the minds of all Israelites who did this was harvest, harvest, harvest. You begin the harvest on a Sunday morning, you work 6 days, you rest the 7th. Work 6 days, rest the 7th. Work 6 days, rest the 7th. That was what they had to learn. One of the things they had to learn. Here was another. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not make a clean riddance of the corners of your fields when you reap. Neither shall you gather any gleaning of the harvest. You shall leave them to the poor and to the stranger. I am the Lord your God. Now, what are the things that we should note? What association should we draw from Leviticus about this particular holy day? 1, there is no connection with the days of unleavened bread, not in Leviticus. The formula that I already pointed out to you makes that clear, along with several other things. Number 2, the wave sheaf was shaken before the Lord on the day after the Sabbath. It began a work week. Everywhere else we are given dates, this is a date. There's no reason why it would not be here. And I think there is an association with the work week. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. The 7th day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. 3, none of the New Year's crop could be eaten until after the sheaf was shaken, thus opening the 7-week harvest. Number 4, Pentecost, the 50th day, the Feast of First Fruits, was on the morrow after the 7th Sabbath. And it's natural as the harvest season should be opened on the first working day. Number 5, the observance of the Sabbath is reinforced for these 7 weeks. You have to keep that in mind. For 7 weeks, you work 6 days, rest the 7th. Why is it so reinforcing in these 7 weeks? Do you have any idea? The reason, if you were ever a farmer, in fact, the reason might be if you're in certain other occupations I could name, is it should become pretty clear to you. There are times of the year when the temptation to work on the Sabbath must be overpowering. I think Mr. Watkins here would know exactly what I'm talking about, being a man who has a great deal of business leading up to April the 15th, the tax season. During that period of time, he has so much work to do, so many things going on, that the temptation to work on the Sabbath is there. My wife is in real estate. She's a real estate agent, and she has people who would call her, if they could, on the Sabbath day. But the people who know her know she doesn't work on Saturday. So they don't. But the pressure is there. The temptation is there. For a person in real estate, they could easily work 7 days a week, and nobody would ever let them rest. And you can imagine in harvest time, especially in a year when you've got a good one, and it's all there, and it's out in the field, and maybe there's a little rain on the horizon, and you're a little concerned about getting it in. The temptation to go ahead and work 7 days a week must be overpowering. I know what I'll do. I'll work 7 days a week now, and I'll keep 2 Sabbaths every week during the hot summer months. How about that? So by requiring them to work 6 days and rest the 7th, the Sabbath day is firmly reinforced in everyone's mind through the repetition that takes place during this particular season. There are 2 leavened loaves, the first fruits offered on the day of first fruits, that is Pentecost. This is interesting. The wave sheaf is the first of the first fruits. These 2 loaves are at the last of the first fruits. They're the ones that are gathered in or actually prepared, and the loaves are presented to God right at the very end. We may talk about that again. Number 7, something was to be left for the poor. And the process of all this is an association with the harvest that's just been going on, or is going on right now, if you were to be in the economy that kept it that way. Number 8, it was a harvest festival having to do with first fruits. Now, while we're in the Old Testament, I want you to turn back with me to the book of Joshua, chapter 5, where there seems to be a reference to this. And it is one that is taken by some, and unfortunately some mistakes are made with it, in the argument that develops around whether or not the Pentecost should be kept on Sivan 6, that is 50 days from the first day of unleavened bread, from the day after that, regardless of where it falls in a day of the week. In Joshua 5, Israel has crossed the river Jordan. They have finally come into the land. They have been circumcised because they had gone for many years without circumcising anyone. In verse 10 it says, Joshua 5 verse 10, the children of Israel encamped in Gilgal and kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month at even in the plains of Jericho. And they did eat of the old corn of the land on the morrow after the Passover, unleavened cakes and parched corn in the selfsame day. Now this is thought to be, especially when it says in verse 12, the manna feast on the morrow after they had eaten of the old corn of the land. It's assumed, I think, that the morrow after the Passover, actually is a reference to the first day of unleavened bread. That is, the morrow is the day after the first day of unleavened bread. This comes from the common usage of referring to the 15th as the Passover because of the fact that that night is when the death angel passed over. And in fact, among Jews, the whole 7 days is referred to as the Passover festival. The idea here is that this particular time, since they were able to eat of the corn of the land, apparently the word old corn is not really correct. It basically just means the produce of the land at that time. But that means that the wave sheaf had to have been offered, or they would not have been allowed to eat of the old corn of the land on that day. Now, that's not an illogical presumption. Now, does that mean then that the morrow after the Sabbath, that is the first day of unleavened bread, is the day from now on when that should be done? It almost sounds like it. Why not? Well, do you realize that about 1/4 or better of the time, in fact, I think about 1/3 of the time, the first day of unleavened bread, the 15th day of the first month, falls on a Saturday, and that therefore every time that happens, the 16th will be on a Sunday. Therefore, in that particular year, you will offer the wave sheaf offering on the morrow after the first day of unleavened bread. It is an annual Sabbath. It is a weekly Sabbath. It is the 15th, and the morrow after it is the 16th. So this really is not terribly relevant to what's under discussion and tells you nothing. It may tell you that in that particular year, the first day of unleavened bread was a Sabbath day. In fact, there's a very strong indication from this then that it is. So there is nothing here, I think, that we can go on. Now let's go on back to 2 Kings, because this is another important scripture in all of the arguments that we get into. In years gone by, I've heard so many people talk about, well, the Jews do this and the Jews do that. The Jews have all of these things that they do, and therefore we ought to look at the Jews and pay attention to the Jews and what they do. Well, yes, they do have a long and honorable tradition, and I think they're very sincere people in doing the things that they do. But there are some things. 2 Kings 22. Josiah was 8 years old when he began to reign. He reigned for 31 years in Jerusalem. His mother's name was Jedediah, the daughter of Adadiah of Boskah. He did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, and he walked in all the way of David his father, and did not turn aside to the right hand or the left hand. It came to pass in the 18th year of Josiah, he'd been king a long time, that the king sent Shaphan the son of Azaliah, the scribe, to the house of the Lord, saying, Go up to Hilkiah the high priest, that he may sum the silver that is brought into the house of the Lord, which the keepers of the door have gathered from the people. Let them deliver it into the hand of the doers of the work that have oversight of the house of the Lord, and let them give it to the doers of the work in the house of the Lord to repair the breaches of the house. The temple was apparently in rotten condition at this time. It had been allowed to go to rack and ruin for year after year after year, as king after king neglected it, as he set the example for the people, and they went off following different gods. They were down in the valley of Hinnom, burning their own children alive to false gods the years prior to this. It's an incredible story, and one that would have to be left for another day. He said, I want all these people to give them the money so we can get to the work. Hilkiah the high priest said in verse 8, and he said to Shaphan the scribe, I have found the book of the law in the house of the Lord. And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan, and he read it. Now, do you realize what we're hearing here? They did not have, and had not had in their possession, the law of God in the lifetime of Josiah. And longer. How long, we do not know. They didn't even know what the book said, folks. The Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. Now, what do you suppose, then, that they had to go on when it came to a question of deciding how and when to observe the Passover? They had precisely the same thing to go on that you and I have. The Torah. That's all. Nothing else. The temple was deserted, had been. The services had not been being performed there. They had not been keeping the law. They had no idea what they were supposed to do. Shaphan the scribe came to the king. He brought the king word again and said, Your servants have gathered the money, but look what we found. We found the book of the law. And Shaphan the scribe showed the king, saying, Hilkiah the priest gave it to me. And he read it before the king. And it came to pass, when the king heard the words of the book of the law, he tore his clothes, which was a sign of mourning and humiliation. He just grabbed hold of his royal robe and rent them right down the middle. And the king commanded Hilkiah the priest and all these people. He said, Go inquire of the Lord for me. Go pray. Ask God. What are we supposed to do? I presume they must have still had the Urim and the Thummim. Inquire of the Lord for me and the people and all Judah regarding the words of this book that is found. For great is the wrath of the Lord that is kindled against us, because our fathers have not listened to the words of this book to do what's written here. So interesting. How could they do what was written there? They didn't even have it. Now then, would you presume that what these people decided to do had any more knowledge of what God intended when the law he gave to Moses than we or any other competent Hebrew scholar who translates it for us might have now in the 20th century? They had exactly the same thing to go on that we had to go on. Now, the reason I'm going into this is I want you to turn back with me to Matthew, the 23rd chapter, because there is right now something being advanced, and a number of people around the church have read it. I don't have any idea how many have taken it seriously, but this is a question that comes up again and again in any case, and I'm glad to have the chance to answer it. But right now, because of the question of Pentecost and whether it should be observed on Sunday, as we do, or whether it should be observed on the 6th of Sivan, devolves on almost entirely upon a historical argument based upon Jewish tradition. I went first of all to 2 Kings 2 to tell you where the origins of Jewish tradition are. They are subsequent to King Josiah. Everything before that is purely written tradition. We've got it, we can look at it, and we can see what's intended. But in Matthew 23, it says in verse 1, Jesus spoke to the multitude and to his disciples, saying, The scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All therefore, whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do, but don't do after their works, because they say and do not. Now that is a disturbing thought. All that they command you, or as he said, all they bid you observe, that observe and do. Now, everybody knows that, at this point in time, it seems to be a historic fact that the Pharisees definitely taught and believed in a Passover, in the Pentecost being observed on the 6th of Sivan. This seems to be a foregone conclusion in history, that the Sadducees, on the other hand, believe it should be observed as we observe it on a Sunday, tomorrow after a Sabbath. The Sadducees, you have to understand, rejected completely oral tradition. And they believed that you were supposed to stick strictly to the written tradition of the Bible. This is why the Sadducees did not believe in a resurrection. If all you had was the Torah, you wouldn't believe in a resurrection either. There's no resurrection in the Torah at all, along with several other things that we believe that the Sadducees did not believe. It may come as a bit of a surprise to you also to realize that there is only one occasion in the entire all of Jesus' ministry where he actually directly addresses the Sadducees alone. Just once. Many times he says Pharisees and Sadducees and condemns them both. But only one time does he directly address the Sadducees alone. It's over the question of the woman whose husband died, and she was married by 7 successive men, and in the resurrection, whose wife shall she be? That's their old trick question about those that believed in the resurrection, but they always true of the Pharisees. But that's the only time he ever encountered them separately. But he did encounter the Pharisees separately on not a few occasions. Now, I want us to think about this a little bit. All, therefore, whatsoever they bid you, observe and do. Now, we don't have to yet go out of this context. I want you just to look down a few verses at verse 13. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! Now, there is no group of people for whom Jesus displays more scorn, and in fact, to their face calls more names than these men. He doesn't seem to have been any more than just a minor rebuke to the Sadducees, because he said, you don't know the Scriptures. You're supposed to know the Scriptures, you don't know the Scriptures. But the Pharisees, he calls them, to their face, hypocrites. How do you feel if somebody looks you right up, walks up, puts his nose against your nose and calls you a hypocrite? I don't think that's a very comforting thing to do. Hypocrite! You shut up the kingdom of heaven against men. You're not going in yourselves, neither do you suffer them that are going in to go in. They were a positive barrier to people going in the kingdom of God. What do you mean, do what the Pharisees say? Well, it's what he said, but how are we to take it? He continues, Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You devour widows' houses, and for a pretense make long prayer. Therefore you're going to receive the greater damnation. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! You compass sea and land to make one proselyte. When he is made, you make him twofold more the child of hell than yourselves. He called these men children of hell. In another place, he called them children of the devil. And he said, the people you convert, you make them twofold more the child of hell than yourselves. You want to follow these guys? Is that what he wants us to do? Is to follow the teaching of men who, when they make a proselyte, make him twofold more the child of hell than themselves? I really am not so sure about that. Turn back to Mark, the 7th chapter, just to get a little bit more of a feeling for what we're looking at here, because it seems that there's been a little misunderstanding someplace. Mark chapter 7, and I'll begin reading in verse 9. He said to them, that is to the Pharisees, I think I'll actually begin in verse 7. I think I made a wrong note here. Beginning in verse, let's begin in verse 5. Then the Pharisees and scribes asked him, Why don't your disciples walk according to the tradition of the elders, but they eat bread with unwashen hands? He answered and said to them, Well has Isaiah prophesied of you hypocrites, as it is written, This people honors me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. In vain do they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men. Who? The Pharisees. That's who. Now, how do you know that one of those doctrines, or the commandments of men that they taught as doctrine, was not when Pentecost is? You can't tell from anything that's being said anywhere in here. And here it is. He said, In vain they worship me, teaching for doctrines the commandments of men, for laying aside the commandment of God, You hold the tradition of men, as the washing of pots and cups and many other such things you do. Not just a few, many other things like this you do. He said to them, full well, you reject the commandment of God so that you can keep your tradition. Now, are these the kind of people who would look back at Leviticus 23 and see the commandment of God that the Pentecost is to be on the morrow after the Sabbath and change it, ignore it, reject it in order that they might keep their own tradition? Oh, surely not. Surely these aren't the sort of people who would make that kind of an error. And yet, that's what Jesus said categorically about them. He said also in verse 13, you make the word of God of none effect through your tradition which you have delivered, and many such like things you do. These are heavy-duty villains we are dealing with here. These aren't just, really good-hearted, kind, and generous people. Now, one writer who's talking about this makes quite a bit about the fact that there were two schools of Pharisees. There was a Shammai school and the Hillel school, and the Shammai school were the bad guys, and the Hillel school was not nearly so bad. Jesus observes no distinction between these people. He just says, Pharisees, hypocrites, snakes in the grass, blind leaders of the blind. Not enamored of these men at all. In fact, back in chapter 15, verse 12, of Matthew 15 and verse 12. Then came his disciples unto him and said, don't you know that the Pharisees were offended when they heard this saying? I dare say they would have been. He answered and said, every plant which my Father has not planted shall be rooted up. The Pharisees were usurpers in that sense. God had not planted them. They would be rooted up. Let them alone. They are blind leaders of the blind, and if the blind lead the blind, they shall both fall into the ditch. Now, that's all strong stuff. Did Jesus contradict himself when he said, whatever the Pharisees bid you do it? Well, let's take a look at that scripture again, because I think it's an easy scripture to misunderstand. First of all, it says that the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. What did Moses do when he sat? I mean, it sounds like an almost silly question in a way, but it's not silly at all. Turn back to Exodus, the 18th chapter. Because there's a fundamental misunderstanding that has dogged this verse from time immemorial. Exodus, the 13th chapter. Exodus, the 18th chapter. I'll get it right in a moment. Exodus 18 and verse 13. It came to pass on the morrow that Moses sat to judge the people. And the people stood by Moses from the morning till the evening. What was going on here? Well, you see, even though they had the law, there were questions upon top of question upon top of question that had to be answered about this or that or the other thing. And it wasn't all merely questions about the law. A lot of it were disputes between people over property, over possessions, over all kinds of things that they may have had. One man may have punched another man's lights out, and the other man was seeking damages because of what had happened to him. And they came to Moses, and Moses was supposed to sit there and make decisions on all these things. This is that famous occasion where Jethro came to Moses and said, hey, you're going to kill yourself. You need to establish a pyramid style of judging here, and you need to have captains of 10 and captains of 100 and captains of 1,000, and let them sit and judge the people. Moses said, hey, that's a good idea. And so he took the hard cases, and they took all the normal routine stuff that was going by all the time, and they judged them before the people. Now, this actually got written into the law. If you want to find it, it's back in Deuteronomy, the 17th chapter, verse 8. Deuteronomy 17 and verse 8. If there arise a matter too hard for you in judgment, between blood and blood, between plea and plea, between stroke and stroke, being matters of controversy within your gates, then you shall arise and get you up to the place which the Lord your God shall choose. You shall come to, and there were three categories of people involved in the judicial system. And that's what we're seeing described here, is Israel's judicial system. You shall come to the priests, to the Levites, and to the judge that shall be in those days, and inquire. They will show you the sentence of judgment. And you shall do according to the sentence which they do of that place which the Lord shall choose, shall show you. You shall observe to do all that they inform you. Now, what you got here is a case of what might be called binding arbitration. If you didn't want to know, you'd had no business asking. If you just sorted out among yourselves, that's the way to do it. And I have no doubt that a good, efficient, quick legal system would lead to a lot more out-of-court settlements than it would to actually going up here. But Moses had a line of them, a long line of them, that he was sitting to judge. But anyway, when it was all said and done, when you got your decision from the priest or the Levite or the judge, you were required, upon pain of death, to do it. This is binding arbitration that's real binding. He says, you do according to the sentence of the law which they shall teach you. In other words, they went back to the law, they took an application of the law, and they applied it to your case. And they created a judgment. Now, judgments are not nearly as permanent as commandments because times change and circumstances change. And the way you would decide a question in Moses' day might be very different from the way you would decide a question in the 20th century. Many of the laws that Moses gave to Israel, which were at the time really protecting women's rights, would be seen as anti-woman in the 20th century, clearly and plainly. That you would not make the same kind of decision. For example, if a man was going to sell his daughter into slavery in that time, the law said how he was to do it, under what circumstances he was to do it, and what obligations they had on the buyer. Would we make that kind of a decision? Would God make that kind of a decision? In our world? No way. A man would not be allowed to sell his daughter in our world. In that world, a different judgment was called upon. That's not hard to understand, is it? Judgment had to be rendered. The law is just not clear enough in all cases to define everything that anyone might ever do. This goes on to say, in verse 11, you do according to the sentence of the law they teach you. You do according to the judgment which they shall tell you. You are not to decline from the sentence to the right hand nor the left hand. The man that will do presumptuously and will not listen to the priest that stands to minister there before the Lord your God or unto the judge, even that man shall die, and you shall put away evil from Israel. Now, did that mean that if you had a judge that told you to break the Sabbath, you could do it? No, absolutely not. That was not the role of a judge. Now, if you come back to the New Testament, I want to help you to understand some more things about this. Matthew 23 again, where we were before, the 23rd chapter, and beginning in verse 1, where the whole question is raised. Matthew 23 and verse 1. Then Jesus said to the multitude and to his disciples, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All there whatsoever they bid you to observe, that observe and do. But don't do after their works, for they say and do not. For they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and they lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. Notice the word bind. Judges make binding and loosing decisions. He said the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. They sit there as judges, and people come to them for decisions. And when the decisions are made, they are bound. Because in society, if your courts are going to mean anything at all, the decisions of those courts have to be followed. So we're talking about between blood and blood, between plea and plea, around property questions and all sorts of things. And he said they have a complete double standard. They bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, which they won't even pick up with their little fingers. So do their judgment, yes. But whatever you do, don't follow their personal example in their own lives, because they are going to cause all kinds of problems to you and to others. So this is what the Pharisees did. They arrived at judgment, but they didn't even live by their own judgment. Now, is there anything crop into your mind relative to the church or to the apostles as we've been reading along through all of this? You recall back in Matthew the 16th chapter, where Jesus asked his disciples who people said he was. And they say, they say, some say you're John the Baptist, and some say you're Elias. He said, yeah, but what do you say I am? Peter said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. Matthew 17 and verse 16 and 17. Jesus answered and said to him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed it to you, but my Father which is in heaven. But I say unto you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. And I will give unto you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Now mind you, this is not merely Peter. In chapter 18, he will say the same thing to all 12. I'll give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatsoever you shall bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. Now, is he granting to his ministry the right to change laws? No, sir. He has given them the right to sit in Moses' seat for the church, to sit in the seat of judgment and to judge according to the law, not to make law, not to set law, not to change law, but they bind and they loose when people come to them with matters too hard for them in judgment. That is really not that difficult to follow through as to what was meant by it. So, are we then today supposed to keep Pentecost in a way that's inconsistent with the law, following the traditions of a group of men who kept their own ways in spite of the law? That is emphatically not what Jesus would say. That is not the purpose of the statement made regarding the Pharisees sitting in Moses' seat. But before we get a complete answer to that question, let's consider the New Testament association with the Feast of Pentecost. What are we supposed to have as impressions or associations? First of all, you recall that the feast is called a Feast of First Fruits. Would you turn back to 1 Corinthians 50? This is not lost on the people that we're dealing with. And back in 1 Corinthians, do you remember, by the way, the time of year when 1 Corinthians was written? It was written at the Passover season. It was written right at the very time when the church was observing the Lord's Supper. We have all those scriptures in there correcting the way they observed the Lord's Supper, rebuking them for it, explaining about it, and so forth. This is the time in the same season of the year where Paul says, let us therefore keep the feast. Not with leavened bread and leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. It is right at the time when the wave sheaf, which is the first fruits, would have been being offered as well. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15, and I think I'll begin reading, find the right place to start here. He says in verse 19, if in this life only we have hope in Christ, we are of all men most miserable. But now is Christ risen from the dead and become the first fruits of them that slept. Paul sees the resurrection of Jesus Christ as him being the first fruits from the dead, the first fruits of those that slept. He identifies the idea of first fruits with resurrection. And Jesus Christ is the first of the first fruits. Now is Christ risen from the dead and become the first fruits of them that slept. For since by man came death, by man came also the resurrection from the dead. But as in Adam, all die. Even so in Christ shall all be made alive. Every man, though, in his own order. Christ, the first fruits. Afterwards they that are Christ at his coming. Now then, with this letter falling as it did right at the Passover season, with all those references, with the fact that it is the Feast of First Fruits that is approaching, would we not be justified in seeing Jesus Christ raised from the dead as symbolic of the first fruits? It would be, in fact, rather hard to escape that, would it not? And, of course, we ourselves are a kind of first fruits. James 1:18 said, of his own will he begat us with the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. Later in Revelation 14:4, these are they who are not defiled with women, that is the 144,000. They are virgins. These are they which follow the Lamb from wherever he goes. They were redeemed from among men, being the first fruits unto God and to the Lamb. Do you realize that the harvest time, that whole sequence of time of the first fruits, running from the wave sheaf offering, that is from the morrow after the Sabbath, during the days of unleavened bread, all the way to the Feast of Pentecost, pictures the time in which you and I are now living, when people are being harvested as first fruits to God and to the Lamb. That's where we are. We're in that period of time right now. Jesus Christ was the first. But then there is to come a time when two leavened loaves are to be presented before God as the first fruits. And that is when we come down to us, to have our chance at being presented to Jesus Christ. Now, in John the 20th chapter, I'd like you to turn to that one. John chapter 20, because here is a time easily identified. This is the morrow after the Sabbath, during the days of unleavened bread. It is a Sunday morning, if you will. John chapter 20, and we'll begin reading. I'm going to just find the right verse I want. Mary, of course, has come to the tomb. In verse 14 it says, when she had said these things, she turned back and saw Jesus standing and didn't know it was him. And Jesus said to her, woman, why are you weeping? Who are you looking for? And she, supposing him to be the gardener, said to him, sir, if you have taken him somewhere, tell me where you have laid him, and I will take him away. Jesus said, Mary. And she turned herself and said, Rabboni, Master. Jesus said to her, touch me not, for I am not yet ascended to my Father. But go to my brethren and say, I ascend to my Father and to your Father, and to my God and your God. Mary went and told them. Now you know later on he appeared to them, and he said, here, put your finger in the nail hole of my hand, and stick your hand in my side. Touch me, feel me. A spirit doesn't have flesh and bone like you see me to have. One, he would not allow her to touch him because he had not yet ascended to the Father. Later he was allowed to be touched. What am I to conclude? That in the intervening time he did ascend to the Father. On the morrow, after the Sabbath, during the days of unleavened bread, at the moment of time when the wave sheaf should have been being offered before God, he presented himself as the first fruit from the dead. Whatever might have been under the Pharisees, whatever might have been observed up until this point in history, there is no question that from this day forward for the church, the morrow after the Sabbath during the days of unleavened bread is the day of the presentation of the first fruits from the dead, symbolically. And that's the association that God intends for us to make with it. There is another association with this. Remember, it's a harvest festival. And the harvest goes on day in, day out, 6 days a week, resting on the Sabbath, for 7 successive weeks. In Matthew 9:37, Jesus said to his disciples, the harvest truly is plenteous, the laborers are few. Matthew 9:38, the very next verse, pray ye therefore the Lord of the harvest, that he will send forth laborers into his harvest. What is he talking about? He's talking about people. He was talking about work to be done. He was talking about people who were hurting and lives that were destroyed. The times when he came and looked at people in multitudes and wept over them because they were like sheep that had no shepherd. And he said, look, we've got to have workers for the harvest. The harvest is plenteous, the laborers are few. Another place in Matthew 13:30, he says concerning the tares and the wheat, let them both grow together until the harvest. In the time of harvest, I'll say to the reapers, gather first the tares and bind them into bundles to burn, but gather the wheat into my barn. Wheat, by the way, is the early first fruits crop. Matthew 13:39, the enemy that sowed them is the devil. The harvest is the end of the world. The reapers are the angels. Therefore he said to them, the harvest is great, verse 10, verse 2, but the laborers are few. Pray the Lord of the harvest that he would send laborers into his harvest. And his own disciples in John 4, verse 35, he said, you say there are yet 4 months, and then comes harvest. He says, I say to you, lift up your eyes, look on the field. They're white already to harvest. You know, if I look at the church and I think, what are we supposed to get in the way of associations out of this? There are some very important ones. One is that there is a harvest. The second is that there is a terrible shortage of people to work in that harvest. And there is absolutely no point in pointing our finger at anyone and saying, why haven't we got more ministers? There's no point in that. There's no point in criticizing the ministerial council. There's no point in criticizing a minister out in the field here or down in Florida or out in California or someplace else because we're not ordaining more ministers. If there is any criticism to be given, his criticism is all given to you. Jesus said, pray you, the Lord of the harvest, that he would send workers into his harvest. There is no other way. Either God will call them and send them, or you don't want them. It isn't a question for me or the ministerial council or for Mr. Armstrong or any of us to be finding or digging out and finding some ministers. We'll try. We'll do our best, and we'll do what we can. But it's not for us. God has to send those workers into the harvest. And there's one more lesson. Maybe the most important of all. There were 7 weeks of harvest, and that was all. You were expected to be finished by Pentecost. When Pentecost came, it was time. Some wheat was going to have to be taken. It was going to have to be roasted, parched, ground up, made meal made out of it, leavening put in it, and 2 loaves made to come and present before God as the first fruit of the harvest. 7 weeks. It is interesting, I stumbled onto it as I was doing my word study today. I'd heard from many people that 7 is a symbol of completion. I didn't realize that it's actually buried in the root of the word 7. That the word for complete and the word 7 come from the same root in Hebrew. 7 is all there is. There are 6 days to work, and the 7th day is a rest. 6 days to work, and the 7th day is a rest. And there's a tendency on our part to assume that that cycle is just going to go on and on and on, but it isn't. There is a limited, finite period of time in which we have to do whatever work it is that God's given us to do, and then there's going to come a time when the time is up. It's over. There are 7 Sabbaths to be complete. And you're going to find that 7th Sabbath you're not working. And the morrow after the 7th Sabbath is the Feast of First Fruits. There's a funny thing, too, about this festival. I'll have to leave it for the day itself to discuss it in any kind of depth. But whenever you read through the things that Peter said about Pentecost, and he said, these men that you're looking at are not drunk like you suppose. This is that which was spoken by the prophet Joel. If you take your Bible and you go back to Joel and you read what Peter is citing, you're going to realize that Peter sees the fulfillment, the ultimate fulfillment of the day of Pentecost. In the day of the Lord, the return of Christ, and the harvest of the first fruits from this earth. Not exactly all that we might have at one time thought it was. We have got a finite period of time in which to do the work. Maybe we ought to be about it.